Well, welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to be here today, even if only virtually. I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present this keynote. And we'll be discussing nitrogen management and some of the regulations that have been appearing in California, specifically as they relate to tree crops. I'm Patrick Brown, professor at Department of Plant Sciences, University of California, Davis. And my collaborator on this is Dr. Darshan Khalsa. Now, for some of you, a little bit of context about California and Californian agriculture. California is a very large and diverse state in the US. It's actually the 5th largest economy in the world as a whole, but part of that economy is very heavily based upon agriculture, with almost 3 million hectares of irrigated acreage and a net production in California of about $45 billion. So it's a very big industry, and it is an industry that's dominated by very high value crops. So dairy, milk, grapes, almonds, strawberry, beef, and a lot of vegetables and other crops as well. All of that dependence on irrigated agriculture and high value agriculture has, however, resulted in a problem. And this was identified in 1990 with a state commissioned report on the status of groundwater in California. And the map to the right here shows you measurements of nitrate in wells of California, surveyed from across California as a whole. And what you can immediately see is there's a good deal of the wells, probably 50% or more, that are contaminated with nitrate above the maximum contaminant level. This ostensibly means that there's almost 250,000 people living in the state of California, mostly those outside of incorporated cities, that are relying upon this contaminated water as their sole source of available water. This is in conflict with Californian Constitution that states that the quality of all the waters of the state shall be protected. And it has resulted in the state government being litigated by a number of environmental justice groups who are concerned about the well-being of these 250,000 people living in the state. Now, an analysis of this was done, a detailed report in 2012 by Thomas Harter and Jay Lund, to identify what was the source of this contaminant. And this is a historical perspective, looking at the inputs of nitrogen into the Californian state. So you'll see here, the columns in the yellow and the pink represent all of the inputs, whether that's fertilizer, manure, or other sources, and also all of the outputs in the blue and the green bars here. And the output represents crop harvest in the green, atmospheric deposition in the gray, stream deposition in the dark blue, and groundwater deposition. But one thing you can see very clearly as you go from 1945 through to the current time is the amount of nitrogen being used in California and removed in crop, etc., has grown dramatically to close to 1 million tons per year. Most importantly, however, if you look at these last 2 bars for 2020, you can see that a great majority of the nitrogen that has been put into the environment is not going into crops. Only about 45% of the nitrogen is harvested in the crop, with the remainder available to be lost to the environment. And this is a major constraint in California, and it's a major reason, of course, as to why the groundwaters of California are contaminated. And as I mentioned, why this is particularly problematic and why it has come to the forefront in California is because of the impact on drinking water, and particularly upon the impact of drinking water of the poorer communities that live and work in agricultural sectors in California. As a consequence of this recognition and as a consequence of the litigation, in 2010, the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program was established. This is a very interesting program and somewhat unique, because even though it was initiated as a governmental activity, it's in fact a hybrid governance scheme that involves both the private sector as well as the government. There is a reporting and a certification requirement that is managed by what are called water quality coalitions. Water quality coalitions are grower organizations that serve to evaluate the activities and collate the activities of all growers within their coalition. And you can see the coalitions numbered on the left here, on the right here. The coalition is responsible for development of nitrogen management plans. They're responsible for farm evaluation plans. They're responsible for annual meetings or more frequent meetings. Growers themselves must either self-certify to be able to make nitrogen, to contribute and to participate in this, or they can choose to use a certified advisor to act upon their behalf. Just to give you a breakdown of how these mandatory programs work, first and foremost, fertilizer recommendations, and this is true for all of agriculture in California, the fertilizer recommendations can only be made by a certified crop advisor that is managed through the American Society of Agronomy, either who have attended a 14-hour nitrogen management training program or have taken the Agronomy Society CCA, that's Certified Crop Advisor Nitrogen Specialization Exam. This is a new program that is just commencing this year. Alternatively, a grower may take this certification themselves and make those decisions themselves. All growers, however, have to have a series of records that are retained either on the farm or submitted to the Water Coalition. They must have a fertilization plan at the beginning of the growing season. They must keep tabs of all of the fertilizer that is applied, including organic matter and nitrogen that may be in the irrigation water. They must conduct pre-season soil nitrogen mapping, record their crop yield and nitrogen removal in harvest, and record nitrogen irrigation management strategies. And I'll show you in a moment how that is managed. At the end of the season, all growers must also submit or retain on their farm, depending on the environment they are in, nitrogen data to the local Water Coalition. And the Water Coalition then will aggregate and submit anonymized data to the state regulatory water board. And this process was established to encourage grower compliance, because it was felt that grower reporting directly to the state water board would have been problematic. The Water Coalition records and tabulates all of this information, creates graphs and tables of the partial nutrient balance ratio for all individuals. They then identify the outliers who are above the mean and notify them of corrective plan. Persistent outliers will be reported to the water boards themselves and subject to regulatory actions. So this is an example of the irrigation nitrogen management plan that each grower must fill for each of their managed units. So it could be a field if it was a field crop, or it could be an orchard. So for every one of these, the grower has to do the following. Firstly, describe the irrigation methods that they're utilizing. Secondly, describe the methods by which they establish the water that will be used in the field. Also an anticipated irrigation, and also information on the known water nitrogen concentrations. The growers are expected to fill in this list of the established nitrogen efficiency practices that have been identified as beneficial. You can see a list of the variety of mechanisms here. This is both, this checkbox here is both to inform growers of the opportunities for nitrogen efficiency practices, but also to validate whether they have used them. And most importantly is the budget component of this. Fundamentally, it's based upon expected yield or expected outputs of nitrogen in the harvested crop, all the sources of nitrogen in the environment, and the applied nitrogen that the grower utilizes. This information is utilized then to calculate the partial nutrient balance, that is, the amount of applied nitrogen that was removed from the field in harvested crop. So obviously, with all of this regulatory requirements of growers and technical requirements of growers, there's a need for universities and extension services and private consultants to assist growers in optimizing how they use nitrogen. And I must have shown this figure 100,000 times, I suspect, over the last 5 to 10 years. But it is very useful because it helps growers think about nitrogen in their environment as not merely how many bags of fertilizer that were applied, but what is the balance between supply and demand? What are the different sources you can see here on the left? What are the different fates of nitrogen in the environment? And how does the timing of application interact with the ultimate efficiency of nitrogen use? At the core, we have adopted very heavily and proposed very heavily the 4Rs management system, which many of you will be familiar with from the International Plant Nutrition Institute. And basically the 4Rs are applying the right rate, which is to match your tree demand with the input from all of the sources of nitrogen in the environment. To do so, to apply your fertilizer at the right time, which means coincident with root uptake, coincidence with plant demand. Put it in the right place to ensure delivery to active roots and minimum loss to deep environments. That requires an integration with the irrigation and fertigation practices. It also requires a consideration of within field variability, not something we've done very well yet, but I'll point some of that out later in this talk. And to utilize the right source, use the right materials to maximize the efficiency and the ultimate use of the nitrogen that is applied by the plant. And as I mentioned, water coalitions, government, non-government agencies, universities have been very active in developing this information for growers and educating growers on its use. So I'm going to step through some of the biology of this and some of the information we have developed to give you a sense of what the foundation is. So determining right rate and right time really requires an estimate of the total nutrient demand of the plant of interest and when that occurs. Now, if you're doing this sort of work in a vegetable crop, it's relatively easy to conduct the sequential yield harvesting and nutrient analysis to develop the necessary curves. Of course, in trees, that's a lot more difficult, but we have had a number of excellent collaborators over the years who have allowed us to remove many dozens of fully mature, highly productive trees and to utilize their labor and staff to help us break them down into their component parts so that we can develop curves and graphs such as this. So whenever we do this work, we do it in very productive orchards, because in order to have agreement from the grower community that the data is valid and relevant to them, it needs to be done in orchards that are highly productive and highly profitable. We conducted a series of excavations. So we pre-selected, in this particular case for almond, 196 trees. We imposed 4 different nitrogen rates over a period of 6 years. We then conducted whole tree excavations, 6 individual trees from each treatment on 3 dates each year for 2 years. We also, in between the excavation dates, conducted tree organ harvesting. So this may be whole limbs, trunks, using coring technologies for below ground tissues as well. That was done multiple times over the year, and it's used to construct this series of bar graphs that you see here, in which we identify the nitrogen content of various perennial and annual tissues. Now I'm going to show you a simplified version of this that's easier to illustrate. So this is the same data. In this case, we've broken the data down into either perennial tissue or just the annual tissues. Remember, this is an 11, 12-year-old highly yielding tree. At the beginning of the year, there is about 450 pounds per acre of nitrogen in the standing biomass. This exercise has been very valuable to teach us not only how much nitrogen is being used by the tree, but when it is being used. So if you go from early dormancy, this is Californian almonds, so they're dormant in January, they start to flower in February, and leaf out occurs in February, March. But over this period, from full dormancy all the way to about 50% leaf expansion, you'll note that the nitrogen content in those trees does not increase. What this implies is that all of the nitrogen required for early leaf out, flowering, and early fruit set is coming from remobilized nitrogen. And only when that remobilized nitrogen is exhausted does uptake occur. Now, though we've done this now in great detail in almond, of course, similar work has been done over the years in a number of crops. The initial work from Peter Millard, Stephen Weinbaum, Isaac Klein, and others. As you enter the grand growth period, as those nuts are expanding, uptake, of course, increases dramatically. In the case of almonds, this is, again, as I mentioned, a high-yielding crop. There's almost 260 pounds of nitrogen in the harvested product alone. And as you move back into dormancy, nitrogen is reallocated from the senescing leaves back into the perennial tissue. And notice that the total nitrogen content at the end of the year is about 35 pounds greater than the nitrogen content at the beginning of the year, representing nitrogen used for new tree growth and nitrogen in the storage tissues. Just to summarize that, from uptake, from dormancy until about 50% leaf out, there's very little uptake occurring. In this particular orchard, there was about 30 pounds of remobilizable nitrogen that had to be exhausted before uptake would occur. There's about 35 pounds of nitrogen accumulated in new perennial tissue. And in this case, with this very high yield, about 260 pounds of nitrogen used for crop growth. This information has been put together. We've done excavations of trees over a number of different age categories and used this to develop a scheme by which most growers can utilize to estimate what their nitrogen demand will be on a orchard of a given year and a given age. Now, we've repeated this type of technology, this type of experimentation with citrus, but also with prunes and walnuts and cherries and a variety of other crops as well. And you can generate the same sort of curve that gives you both information on total demand during the year, but also the seasonality of that demand. We move into the question of right timing. There's a number of ways to approach this. Certainly, information on the increment in nitrogen in the crop itself is important, but you can also look at root growth as an indicator of when fertilizer should be applied on the ground. We've done this extensively with rhizoton tubes, and you can generate graphs such as this that illustrate when new roots are being produced. Again, not a lot of root production prior to that full leaf out, and then a dramatic root production as you go through the fruit development phase and fruit filling phase, after which it drops off dramatically. It's interesting, there's not a lot of new root growth from about June onwards, even though there is substantial nitrogen uptake still occurring at this period. Very little new root growth once you approach harvest, and a small flush in some years, that's 2013, at the end of the year, but in other years, no flush of substantial amounts of roots toward the end of the year. We've also done a lot of work at looking where roots exist within the root profile. So this is going from soil surface down to 90 centimeters, and you have about 90% of all active roots in the top 50, 60 centimeters of the soil. The information on the localization of the fine roots and the seasonality of its growth can be used to guide fertigation strategies. And we've been doing a number of trials on using modeling approaches to predict where a fertigated nitrate application will be deposited within the root zone. We've also been doing some direct measurements of this. This particular pattern of distribution that you see here is a poorly managed nitrogen irrigation. In this particular case, the nitrate was injected at the beginning of a 12-hour irrigation run, followed by, of course, the 10 to 12 hours of water. And unsurprisingly, most of the nitrate has been deposited at the bottom of the wetted zone, where it's likely to be poorly recovered. We have been working a lot with growers to illustrate these principles, to encourage injection of nitrate late in the irrigation cycle to avoid this problem. Right placement is more than simply placement in depth. And this is an example of a pistachio field where we've harvested each individual tree, about 12,000 data points krieged here. You see trees, of course, varying in productivity from about 116 pounds per tree to about 45 pounds per tree. And you have a challenge in these kinds of fields because you have a single irrigation and fertigation point, typically in most Californian fields. So very little or to no precision agriculture. Trying to decide upon an irrigation and a fertigation rate that is suitable for the field as a whole when you have this degree of variability is, of course, very difficult. The standard practice, of course, would be for growers to target the needs of the highest performing plants, which of course means overfeeding the majority of the orchard. That represents a great challenge that has not been addressed in Californian agriculture. And clearly the next phase of nitrogen use efficiency will require a management at a scale less than the entire field. And counterintuitively, the larger the field we go, with the more integrated adoption of drip irrigation and fertigation, the worse the problem becomes. Coming back to this irrigation management plan that every grower must utilize, you can see how we've contributed a lot of information to filling in this table, to assisting growers in managing their crops so that these decisions can be made. But we can't lose track of the ultimate goal. And the ultimate goal is to improve the drinking water of California. And there is a good deal of pressure in California to suggest that the approach of simply accounting for application and removal is not sufficient. And indeed, if you model what is likely to occur in the groundwaters of California, this is the trend since 1960 to 2010. This is the predicted trend over the next 50 years. And you can see that the situation is going to get much worse before it gets better. And this has placed some considerable pressure on growers and on the managers of nitrogen in California, that even doing what we are doing, which is clearly an improvement, may not be sufficient to solve the problem. So I've spoken a lot about the technological and the agronomic considerations, engineering considerations. One of the things we've been involved a lot in recently is to analyze, how do growers make decisions? How do they use this information? What factors determine whether a program such as has been implemented in California will be successful? And this is my first major foray into the social sciences. And I must say that working in the social sciences and understanding grower behavior and decision-making is far more complex than any of the agriculture or the biology or the engineering that I've been involved in. A joint project with a number of researchers listed here. So what did we do in this project? Well, fundamentally, this is a survey, a stakeholder analysis project to ask and answer the questions: which practices are growers using from the suite of practices that we have developed, and what determines which of these practices they will adopt, whether they're fertilizer, irrigation, soil, or groups of practices. We also ask the question, what are the barriers? What are the factors that prevent growers from adopting a technology or an approach? And what are the motivations that make them do so? We've looked at extensively, where do growers get their information and how can we influence the behavior of growers through information. We've also looked at what are the policy tools that are effective, voluntary ones, mandatory ones, and who has the biggest influence on altering grower behavior. As I said, a lot of different data going into this. These were some large grower meetings that were done with almost 1,000 attendees, and some surveys that were established and sent out to a number of the different growing regions in the state. So I'm just going to show you a brief summary from the first round of surveys that were produced. So asking the question, what are your information sources for growers in California? At the highest is the grower's own perception of their knowledge, their own past experience. Second, but almost as high, are the pest control advisors. Now, pest control advisors in California play a large role. These are mostly representatives of agricultural chemical companies who play a large role in advising growers on the use of agricultural chemicals, both fertilizers as well as pests and disease controls. Fellow growers, and then you have the information sources from the university, from the extension services. Now, we may initially be a little upset that we don't rate more highly, except it's clear that we play the role, that is the University of California, the Cooperative Extension, in providing the education that the pest control advisors act upon. So we are the conduit for this information. Many of the governmental agencies, the mandatory agencies, are much less utilized as sources of information. We also asked which of the suite of technologies that we've developed are being used. And some of them are very promising. Soil sampling to establish your nitrogen rates, split applications, nitrogen budgets are all adopted by greater than 50%, and more recently, probably about 75% of growers. So this is promising. Many of the technologies associated with water use, however, are still not being widely used. Whether it's pressure chamber or ET scheduling, soil moistures, 30%, 20%, depending on the technology. So there's room here for improvement. And since the management of nitrogen is implicitly regulated or influenced by the management of water, this is very important. With regard to the barriers to adoption, we've listed the major barriers here, from those which are greatest to those which are smallest. The government regulations themselves are perceived as the major barrier to better nitrogen management. So this speaks to grower perceptions of government regulations and government interference in their business. Perhaps not surprising. But more importantly, the real barriers that are coming to the top time and time again are uncertainty. That is, what will the impact of the adoption of these technologies have on yields? What will the impact be on their ROI, the return on investment? And even what will the impact be on nutrient use efficiency? So clearly we have more work to do to demonstrate the efficiency of these mechanisms, the certainty of these mechanisms as a means to the end of minimizing nitrogen pollution while optimizing productivity. Not well, surprisingly perhaps, but importantly, it's in fact not a lack of knowledge or technology that is a primary grower. Neither is it a lack of information coming from extension and outreach. We're doing a good job there. What we've not done a good enough job is demonstrating that the technologies can be used and profitability maintained. If you summarize that here as what are the overarching factors that represent barriers to adoption, it is uncertainty. So all the way across to the sometimes, the often, and the always, most growers feel uncertain about the validity and the efficacy of these technologies. As I said, technical knowledge is not the primary driver. Neither necessarily are the availability of resources, though that is still important. None of this is possible without a tremendous amount of outreach directly to growers. And I must have given 50 talks myself on these topics. We're heavily involved in the training of the crop advisors, in the making and the development of the management practices, the monitoring and evaluation, and the field days. I cannot emphasize too much how important this is to managing any change in an agricultural environment. What we've learned overall, adoption rates vary by farmer practice. We've probably grabbed the low-hanging fruit. The more difficult things remain. On the barriers and the motivations, it is this uncertainty of how will this impact my bottom line that more work needs to be done. On the information networks, they exist, they're quite effective. We really must play a very key role in how we influence the behavior and the information that is coming from private consultants. Overall, growers have been very happy with the hybrid system. So I'm just going to wrap up with a lesson here. We have tremendous technologies and information on how all of this works and what we can do to optimize. There are some clear constraints that still exist. Managing your irrigation technologies to optimize utilization, optimizing your variability, addressing the variability that exists in the field is also tremendously important. Some of that will come from tools, but the development of any of these tools have to be seamless and they have to fit well within the grower's reality and the grower constraints. And in California in particular, growers have been very reticent to utilize decision support systems, computer-based systems. It's coming, but it is not there yet. We clearly need to understand what helps make growers make decisions and what are the barriers that constrain them. So this sort of work, the social science work, remains incredibly important in this kind of innovation. With that, I have a number of folks to thank for this work. And thank you very much for your attendance and for listening.